Now, the first reaction we will be looking at is swirl. This happens when Animo meets any pyro, hydro, electro, or cryo aura. So, what it will do is it will mainly spread the element that the Animo reacts with. So, for example, we apply electro, and then you can see swirl. This enemy also gets affected by electro. The next reaction we will be looking at will be crystallize, which happens when Geo meets any pyro, hydro, electro, or cryo element. And when that happens, it will summon a crystal shard that when you pick up will generate a shield for you. So for example, we will apply hydro and Geo. You can see crystallize. There is a crystal shard right there, and when we take it, we have a shield. This shield will be pretty weak, but it will deflect some damage. The next reaction we will be looking at will be freeze. This happens when hydro meets any cryo element, and what it will do is it will freeze the enemy in place. It will not work on boss enemies. So we apply hydro, then cryo. We can see that the enemy is frozen for a few seconds. Now the next element we'll be going over is electro charge. This occurs when hydro meets any electro element, and what it will do is it will deal damage over time to enemies that are affected by it. So first, we will apply hydro and electro. We can see that enemy will be taking some damage over time. Again, yes. Our next set of reactions come in sort of a group. This is called, or these are called the bloom reactions, and bloom, the first reaction we'll be looking at, which is bloom, happens when hydro meets any dendro element. It will create a seed that will explode after a short time, and it will deal dendro damage. There can only be 5 seeds at a time on your screen, and once it reaches that limit, the oldest seed will explode. So first, we'll apply hydro and dendro. We can see bloom. There's a seed right there, and if we wait a few seconds, it will explode, dealing dendro damage. Now, those bloom seeds that generate when bloom happens, they're called dendro cores, and certain reactions can also happen once you trigger said dendro cores. The first sub-reaction of bloom that we will be looking at is called burgeon. This happens when those dendro cores are inflicted with pyro. They will explode into a fairly large AoE and will deal dendro damage. So what we have to do first is trigger bloom. We can see a bloom seed right there, a dendro core. Once we hit it with pyro, we can see burgeon, and Diluc died, but we saw burgeon, which dealt dendro damage. The next bloom sub-reaction we will be discussing is hyper bloom. This occurs when the dendro cores generated by bloom gets hit by electro. What it will do is it will spawn a projectile that homes in on enemies, and once it hits, it will deal dendro damage. So just like with burgeon, we have to first trigger bloom, get that seed on the ground, and once we hit it with electro, we can see hyper bloom. It created a little projectile, went to this enemy, and dealt dendro damage. Now, The next reaction we will go over is called burn. This happens when pyro meets a dendro element, and what will happen is it will create or will trigger burn, which will deal damage over time to the enemy. So first we can put dendro on this enemy, put pyro, we can see burning, and it will deal damage over time. Again, we can trigger. There we go, we have dendro on the enemy, trigger burn, there. Our next elemental reaction will be overload. This happens when pyro meets electro, and what it will do is it will create a small explosion on the enemy that gets affected by overload, and it will deal a separate instance of damage, which will be called overloaded damage, and it can knock lighter enemies backwards, dealing a significant amount of knockback. So we can inflict this enemy with pyro and electro. We can see overload. The next reaction we will be going over is actually vaporize. Now vaporize happens when hydro meets pyro. However, something to note about vaporize is there are two different types of vaporize. It's not necessarily indicated in the game, but it is in the code in the damage calculation. So the first one we will be discussing is called a reverse vaporize. This happens when pyro already meets an existing hydro. So essentially the order will become if you inflict an enemy with hydro first, then you inflict that same enemy with pyro next, it will trigger reverse vaporize, which is still under vaporize, but what it will do is it will multiply the pyro character's damage by 1.5 times. So first we have to put hydro on this enemy and do pyro. We can see it's still set vaporize, but in the in-game code that multiplied our damage by 1.5. Now the other vaporize reaction is called forward vaporize. This happens when hydro meets an already existing pyro element. So the order would be when you inflict an enemy with pyro first, and then you inflict that enemy with hydro next, it will trigger forward vaporize, which again, just like reverse vaporize, will still be shown as vaporize in the game, but this time that hydro enemy's damage will be multiplied by 2. So just like the order, we do pyro and then hydro, and see still does vaporize, but in the code it would have done forward vaporize, 2 times the damage of our hydro character. Our next reaction, again these reactions also come in a set just like the bloom reactions, and these reactions are called the quicken / catalyze reactions. I will be referring to them as the quicken reactions because that's how I just refer to them. But essentially, once dendro meets electro, quicken will happen. So we can showcase that now. So we can see dendro and electro, we can see quicken happens, and quicken can be indicated by the green lightning coming out of the enemy. This means that it will have this quote-unquote quicken aura. Oops. Now for the sub-reactions of quicken, there are 2. The first one we will be going over is called spread. As I've mentioned, quicken happens when dendro meets electro, and this will create this quicken aura that is indicated by green lightning around the enemy. When we hit an enemy that has this green lightning around them, that has this quicken aura, with Dendro, it will trigger the spread reaction. Now what spread does is it will increase that Dendro character's dealt damage to that enemy affected by quicken. So first we have to trigger quicken. And you can see that enemy has green lightning. Once we inflict Dendro, we saw spread, and that would have increased our Dendro damage. Now the next sub-reaction of quicken we will be discussing is called aggravate. Again, just like spread, aggravate only happens when we hit an enemy with a quicken aura, but this time with electro. And again, like spread, it will increase our electro damage. So first we have to trigger quicken. You can see green lightning quicken on the enemy. Once we put another electro, we can see aggravate. That would have, again like that would have dealt increased electro damage. The next reaction we will be talking about is called superconduct. Superconduct occurs when cryo meets an electro. So what this does is it will decrease that enemy's physical resistance for a short while. So to test it out, we can see that when I hit this enemy with a physical attack, it does 21 damage. Now I put cryo and electro, we can see superconduct. Now I deal 25. Our next element, the elemental reaction that we will discuss, is called melt. And just like vaporize, melt has two types: reverse melt and forward melt. Again, just like vaporize, reverse or forward melt doesn't really doesn't get indicated in game, but it is written in the code, and it will affect how much damage we deal to our enemy. So reverse melt happens when we apply pyro first to the enemy and then we apply cryo next. So you can see pyro and cryo will trigger melt. What this does is it will increase our cryo damage by 1.5%. Now we see the other half of melt, which is forward melt. Forward melt will occur when we hit our enemy with cryo first and then we hit them with pyro next. Just like reverse melt, it will only be triggered as melt, but in the game code we will be doing more damage. In this case, we will be doing 2 times more damage because we're proccing forward melt. So I do cryo and do pyro. You can see only melt. Oh shit. You can see only melt, but in the in-game code that would have registered as a forward melt, dealing 2 times pyro damage. So yeah, that will be our simple elemental reaction guide. Pretty a lot. It was a lot, but I hope you learned. Of course, these elemental reactions are far more complex than how I showcase them, and the most complex that I actually went was the forward and reverse reactions. But a lot of these things are much more complex than they seem, and certainly much more complex than how I explained them. So if you want to learn more about that, I would recommend watching Sajef77's video on elemental reactions, part 1 and 2. It's a great resource in general, and it's available on YouTube. So yeah,